I still remember the first time I saw the house. A crumbling Victorian relic perched at the edge of the woods like a vulture, its dark silhouette etched against the crimson dusk. The realtor's grin was far too wide for someone trying to sell a house that had lingered unsold for decades. "You won't find a better deal in the county," she said, brushing aside concerns like cobwebs. In hindsight, her cheerfulness felt as hollow as the echo of my footsteps in the house's vacant hallways. The price was absurdly low, the kind of price that made you raise your eyebrows and wonder what was wrong. Termites, black mold, a dubious history. I asked all the questions you're supposed to ask when buying a house, but the answers only grew vaguer, more evasive. "It's an old house," she said with a shrug. "A little peculiar, sure, but nothing that a bit of love and care can't fix." A little peculiar. That phrase would haunt me. The house was massive, with towering ceilings and ornate carvings on the walls. Dust cloaked every surface like a shroud, and the air smelled faintly of mildew and something metallic. Still, it had charm, or so I told myself. I was desperate for a fresh start, and this house seemed like the perfect blank slate. I signed the papers that very evening, my hand trembling only slightly. In the euphoria of the moment, I didn't notice the flicker of relief in the realtor's eyes. I didn't notice how quickly she gathered her things and left, as if fleeing some unseen spectre. It was my house now, my dream, my bargain. That night, as I stood in the living room surveying my new domain, I felt it for the first time, a whisper of movement, a subtle shift in the air, as though the house itself had exhaled. I froze, listening. The wind, a draft? I laughed it off and told myself I was just jittery. Moving was stressful after all. But the house wasn't laughing. The first week passed uneventfully, or so it seemed. I painted over the peeling wallpaper, replaced the cracked tiles in the kitchen, and swept away decades of grime. Yet no matter how much I scrubbed, the house resisted my efforts. The walls felt alive beneath my touch, their surfaces strangely warm in places, as if they had a pulse. At night, I began to notice strange sounds, the groan of wood settling, the faint creak of footsteps on the floor above me when I was alone, and always that same whispering draft, as if the house were breathing in slow, deliberate rhythms. I tried to rationalize it. Old houses creak, pipes make noise, but deep down, I knew there was something more. Then came the dreams. They started on the fourth night, vivid and visceral. In them, I wandered the house, only it wasn't the house I knew. The walls wept crimson, and doorways led to endless corridors that twisted like a maze. A voice would call to me, a low, mournful whisper that seemed to echo from the very bones of the house. "Why are you here?" it would ask, over and over, growing louder until I woke drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. One night, after waking from another nightmare, I decided to confront my fears head-on. Armed with a flashlight, I ventured into the basement, a cavernous space I had barely glanced at since moving in. The air grew colder with every step, and the shadows seemed to close in around me. At the center of the room, beneath layers of dust, I found something I hadn't noticed before. A circular pattern carved into the concrete floor. The design was intricate, almost hypnotic, and it radiated an unsettling energy. I reached out to trace the grooves with my fingers, but the moment I touched it, a sound erupted from above. A guttural groan, like a great beast waking from slumber. I stumbled back, my flashlight beam trembling. The house was alive. I was sure of it. As I ascended the stairs, the breathing grew louder. The walls seemed to close in, and for the first time, I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. When I reached the top, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening thud. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. By dawn, I had made up my mind to leave. Whatever charm the house had held was gone, replaced by an oppressive, suffocating dread. I packed a bag and called the realtor, but she didn't answer. I called again and again. The line went dead. That's when I heard it. The voice from my dreams. Stay. It came from the walls, from the floor, from everywhere and nowhere. A single word spoken with an unnatural resonance that made my skin crawl. I ran to the door, desperate to escape, but the key wouldn't turn. The windows wouldn't budge. I was trapped. The house had claimed me. By the time I realized I wasn't alone, it was too late to turn back. The first few days after the door slammed shut were a blur of unease and denial. I convinced myself there had to be a rational explanation for everything. The breathing walls, the strange patterns in the basement, the oppressive sense of being watched. I even chalked up the locked doors and sealed windows to my own clumsiness. Old houses are quirky, I muttered to myself, though the words felt hollow. Deep down, I knew the house was something else entirely. I tried to carry on with life as best as I could. I cleaned, unpacked, and distracted myself with podcasts and TV shows. Normalcy was the goal, but it was the one thing the house refused to grant me. Every night, as darkness wrapped itself around the house, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, so faint I thought they were the wind. But as the nights dragged on, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to seep from the walls themselves, a symphony of disjointed voices, each one layered atop the other. Some were mournful, others angry, but all shared one thing, a bone-chilling clarity. Stay. Leave. Help us. I tried recording the sounds on my phone, desperate for proof that I wasn't losing my mind. But when I played back the recordings, there was nothing but static. One evening, as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the walls in shades of amber and crimson, I decided I'd had enough. This was my house, my sanctuary, and I wasn't going to be driven out by creaking wood and strange noises. Armed with a flashlight, I marched to the basement once more. The basement felt colder than before, as if the house had drawn its breath inward. Shadows clung to the corners, and the faint smell of earth and rust filled my nostrils. The circular pattern in the floor caught my eye again, and this time I noticed something new. Faint symbols etched around its edges, half hidden beneath years of grime. Curiosity and fear wrestled within me, but curiosity won. I grabbed a rag from a nearby shelf and began to scrub away the dirt, revealing the symbols beneath. They looked ancient, their jagged lines and swirling curves unlike anything I'd ever seen. Goosebumps prickled my arms as I worked. Then, as if on cue, the whispers began again. "Why are you here?" one voice asked, low and guttural. "Run!" hissed another, its tone sharp and urgent. The flashlight flickered in my trembling hand, casting erratic shadows across the walls. I tried to block out the voices, focusing on the task at hand. The more I cleaned, the more the symbols emerged. A language I couldn't read but instinctively knew was dangerous. And then I saw it. Nestled at the center of the pattern was a small, rusted object, a key, ancient and unassuming. It felt heavy in my hand, as though it carried the weight of centuries. The moment I picked it up, the breathing stopped. The house fell silent, the kind of silence that pressed against your ears and made your pulse thunder. I didn't have time to revel in the quiet. The floor beneath me began to tremble, the vibrations subtle at first but quickly intensifying. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and the walls groaned like a living thing in agony. Instinct took over, and I bolted up the stairs, clutching the key like a lifeline. The door at the top swung open before I could touch it, as if the house were mocking me. I stumbled into the living room, gasping for air, and slammed the door shut behind me. That night, I stared at the key, turning it over in my hands. Its surface was etched with the same symbols as the floor, and though I couldn't understand them, I felt their meaning in my bones. The key wasn't just a tool. It was a warning, a promise, and a curse, all at once. Sleep was out of the question. Every creak of the house, every faint rustle of wind sent my heart racing. I sat in the corner of the living room, the key clutched tightly in my fist, and waited for dawn. When the first rays of sunlight broke through the curtains, the house seemed to retreat, its oppressive presence lifting just slightly. For the first time, I dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, I could find a way out. But the house wasn't done with me yet. As I stood to stretch, something caught my eye. A single word scratched into the wall above the fireplace, its letters jagged and uneven, as though carved in a frenzy. Why? My blood ran cold. The house had questions, and I had no answers. It began with a faint knocking. I had barely drifted off when the sound jolted me awake. 3 sharp raps, steady and deliberate, echoed through the stillness of the night. At first, I thought someone was at the front door, a late-night visitor perhaps, though I knew how absurd that idea was. Who would knock on the door of a house that seemed to breathe? Groggily, I reached for my phone to check the time. The screen glared back at me. 3:03 a.m. My heart sank. I waited for the knocking to come again. Seconds stretched into minutes, but the house remained silent. Finally, I convinced myself it had been a dream, a fragment of the unsettling whispers that had plagued me since I arrived. I lay back down, clutching the key I'd found in the basement like a talisman. But then it came again. This time it wasn't at the front door. It was closer. The knocking seemed to come from inside the house, from deep within its labyrinthine corridors. It was a slow, deliberate sound, the kind that sent shivers crawling up your spine. I sat up, my breath shallow, and scanned the room. The shadows on the wall seemed darker than before, stretching like reaching hands. I had to investigate. Armed with nothing but my flashlight and the key, I crept down the hallway. The floorboards creaked under my weight, their protests swallowed by the oppressive silence that filled the house. The knocking had stopped again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was waiting for me to follow. As I moved deeper into the house, the air grew colder, denser, as though the walls themselves were closing in. The corridor seemed longer than I remembered, twisting in ways that defied logic. I passed door after door, each one shut tight, their surfaces scarred with years of neglect. And then I found it. At the end of the hallway was a door I had never seen before. It was smaller than the others, its wood warped and splintered as if it had been forced into place. Something about it felt wrong, its presence unnatural, like it didn't belong in this house or any other. The knocking came again, louder this time, and I realized with a jolt that it was coming from behind the door. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I should have walked away. Any sane person would have turned and run as far as they could. But curiosity, that insidious whisper in the back of my mind, kept me rooted in place. I reached out, my hand shaking, and grasped the doorknob. It was ice cold. When I turned the knob, the door creaked open with agonizing slowness, revealing a staircase that spiraled downward into darkness. The air that wafted up was thick with the scent of damp earth and something metallic, blood maybe, or rust. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to close the door and never look back. But something deeper compelled me to continue. Maybe it was the key in my pocket, its weight a constant reminder of the basement's secrets. Or maybe it was the whispers, now faint but persistent, urging me onward. The staircase seemed endless, each step plunging me deeper into the house's shadowy heart. The walls were bare, their surfaces rough and jagged as though carved from stone. I clung to the banister, the wood splintering beneath my grip. When I finally reached the bottom, I found myself in a small chamber. It was unlike any room I'd seen before, its walls covered in the same strange symbols as the pattern in the basement. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on it sat a wooden box, its surface inlaid with intricate carvings that seemed to shift and writhe in the dim light. The knocking had stopped, replaced by a low hum that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. I approached the box, my heart pounding, and reached out to touch it. The moment my fingers brushed the wood, a deafening roar filled the room. The walls began to shake, and the floor beneath me buckled. A voice echoed in the chamber, deep and resonant, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. And then, as suddenly as it had started, everything went still. The box was open. Inside, nestled among layers of velvet, was a photograph, a black and white image of a family standing in front of the house. The man, woman, and 2 children looked solemn, their expressions tinged with something I couldn't quite place. And in the background, barely visible, was a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. The photograph haunted me. I carried it back upstairs that night, my hands shaking as I carefully examined the faces frozen in time. The family, man, woman, 2 children, seemed ordinary at first glance. They stood rigidly before the house, their posture stiff and formal, their expressions neutral. But the more I studied the photo, the more the unease crept in. The father's eyes weren't focused on the camera, but on something just out of frame, his lips pressed tightly together, as though suppressing a secret. The mother's smile was brittle, her hands gripping the children's shoulders with an intensity that seemed almost desperate. And the children, their blank stares sent a chill down my spine. But it wasn't the family that terrified me the most. It was the figure standing in the doorway, barely visible in the shadow of the porch. It wasn't a trick of the light, of that I was certain. The figure was tall and gaunt, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if listening intently. Its face was obscured, blurred beyond recognition, but its presence was undeniable. A silent spectre watching over the family, or perhaps watching me. I flipped the photo over, desperate for some context, and found a single word scrawled on the back in faded ink: 13. I spent the next day in a haze of paranoia, jumping at every sound, every shadow that flickered across the walls. The house seemed to sense my unease, its breathing growing louder, more pronounced. Every so often, I heard faint whispers emanating from the walls, not words this time, but a low, rhythmic hum that seemed to vibrate in my chest. By midday, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I pulled out my laptop and began scouring the internet for any information about the house's history. Hours passed as I sifted through property records, old newspaper articles, and forum posts. The house had been built in the late 1800s by a man named Elias Harrow, a reclusive architect known for his unconventional designs and rumored occult interests. He had lived in the house with his family for 13 years before they all vanished without a trace. The house had changed hands several times after that, but no owner ever stayed for long. Stories of strange occurrences, unexplained noises, sudden illnesses, mysterious disappearances littered the property's history. One article mentioned a particularly chilling detail. Every owner who had lived in the house had reported seeing the same figure, the man in the photograph. A chill ran down my spine. 13 years, 13 owners. The word scrawled on the back of the photograph suddenly felt like a warning. That night, the knocking returned, more insistent than before. It echoed through the house, coming from every direction at once, as though the walls themselves were alive. My heart raced as I crept through the darkened hallways, the flashlight trembling in my grip. The door at the end of the corridor, the one I had opened the night before, was ajar. A faint light spilled out, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance and writhe. The whispers grew louder as I approached, their dissonant tones forming a melody that was both mesmerizing and maddening. When I stepped inside, I found the staircase once again spiraling downward, but this time the descent felt different. The air was heavier, the shadows darker, and the walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own. I clutched the key in my pocket, its cold metal grounding me as I pressed onward. At the bottom of the staircase, the chamber awaited me, unchanged from the night before. But the wooden box was gone. In its place was a single chair, its surface worn and splintered. On the chair sat a figure, a man, his head bowed, his hands clasped tightly together. His clothes were tattered, his frame unnaturally thin, and his presence radiated an overwhelming sense of dread. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The man lifted his head, and I staggered back in horror. It was the same face from the photograph, the same hollow eyes, the same gaunt features. But his expression was twisted with anguish, his mouth opening and closing as though struggling to form words. When he finally spoke, his voice was a raspy whisper, barely more than a breath. 13, he said. 13 lives, 13 years. Before I could respond, the whispers erupted into a deafening roar, and the room plunged into darkness. When I woke, I was back in the living room, sprawled on the cold wooden floor. My flashlight lay beside me, its weak beam flickering against the walls. The key was still in my pocket, but the photograph was gone. I sat up slowly, the events of the night before rushing back like a nightmare I couldn't escape. The chamber, the chair, the man from the photograph. His haunting words echoed in my mind. 13 lives, 13 years. For the first time since moving in, I allowed myself to admit the truth. The house was alive, and it wanted something from me. The next few days passed in a haze of fear and confusion. I barely slept, afraid of what the house might do if I closed my eyes. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, their fragmented voices weaving together in a dissonant chorus. I couldn't understand their words, but I felt their meaning deep in my bones. A command, a warning, a plea. I tried to leave. I packed a bag, grabbed my car keys, and made a beeline for the front door. But no matter how hard I turned the knob, the door wouldn't budge. The windows, too, were sealed tight, their glass unyielding no matter how hard I struck them. The house had trapped me, and I was running out of time. On the third day, the knocking returned. This time, it was accompanied by something worse, footsteps. They started faintly, a soft shuffle that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but as the hours dragged on, the footsteps grew louder, more deliberate. They moved through the house with a purpose, pacing the hallways, climbing the stairs, circling the rooms. I wasn't alone. That night, the knocking and footsteps led me back to the door at the end of the corridor. It was ajar again, and the faint glow of light spilled out into the hallway. My heart pounded as I approached, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But the house wouldn't let me. The staircase was the same as before, spiraling downward into darkness. But this time, the walls were covered in writing. Words, sentences, entire passages scrawled in a language I didn't recognize. The symbols seemed to pulse and writhe, their shapes shifting in the flickering light. At the bottom of the stairs, the chamber awaited me once more. The chair was empty now, but the sense of dread remained, heavy and suffocating. The whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. And then I saw it. In the far corner of the chamber stood a figure, tall, gaunt and motionless. Its features were obscured by shadows, but I recognized it immediately. The man from the photograph, the keeper of the house. He turned slowly, his movements jerky and unnatural, as though his body were resisting him. When he spoke, his voice was a rasping whisper, barely audible over the roar of the whispers. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his hollow eyes fixed on me. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" He took a step closer, his presence radiating an overwhelming sense of despair. "The house needs you," he said. "It's always needed someone." "Needed someone for what?" "To keep it alive," he replied. "To feed it." His words sent a chill down my spine. "Feed it? Feed it what?" He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and glinting. Another key. He held it out to me, his hand trembling. "Take it," he said. "You'll need it for the door." "What door?" "You'll see," he said. "But be careful. Once you open it, there's no turning back." I hesitated, my instinct screaming at me to run. But something deeper, curiosity, fear, desperation, compelled me to take the key. The moment it touched my hand, the chamber erupted in a deafening roar. The keeper's hollow eyes locked onto mine. "Remember," he said, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. "The house breathes, and it hungers." And then he was gone. When I emerged from the chamber, clutching the second key, the house was silent. The whispers, the knocking, the footsteps, all of it had stopped. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was oppressive, like the calm before a storm. The second key was heavier than the first, its surface etched with the same strange symbols. As I turned it over in my hand, a single thought consumed me. What was behind the door it would unlock? The house had gone silent, but it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a predator watching its prey. I spent hours sitting in the living room, staring at the second key, the weight of it pressing down on me as if it carried the house's malevolence. I knew it would lead to another door, another descent into the labyrinth of horrors that lay beneath this cursed place. but I couldn't ignore it. The house wouldn't let me. By nightfall, the whispers returned, softer this time, their dissonant tones weaving a haunting melody. The walls seemed to breathe again, their rhythm slow and deliberate, as though the house was lulling me into a full sense of security. And then the knocking began. It was faint at first, a soft tap, tap, tap that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. But as the minutes ticked by, it grew louder, more insistent, until it became a deafening cacophony. "All right," I shouted, my voice cracking. "I'll go. Just stop." The knocking ceased immediately, as if the house had been waiting for my surrender. I followed the soundless pull of the house, the second key clutched tightly in my hand. It led me to a door I had never seen before, hidden behind a heavy curtain in the dining room. The door was smaller than the others, its wood dark and splintered, with no handle or keyhole in sight. The whispers swelled as I approached, their voices blending into a single, commanding chant. "Feed, feed, feed." I held up the key, uncertain what to do, when the symbols etched into its surface began to glow. The door shuddered and creaked, its wood twisting and splintering until it opened on its own, revealing another staircase descending into darkness. The air grew colder with each step, the shadows pressing in around me like a living entity. The walls were covered in more of the strange writing, their symbols glowing faintly in the dim light. My breathing grew shallow as the whispers guided me deeper into the belly of the house. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a cavernous chamber, its walls carved from stone and pulsating with a faint, otherworldly light. In the center of the room stood a massive stone altar, its surface slick with a dark, viscous substance that I didn't want to identify. Chains hung from the ceiling, their rusted links swaying gently despite the absence of any breeze. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and my stomach churned as I approached the altar. It was then that I noticed the figures. They lined the walls, their forms shrouded in shadow, but unmistakably human. Or at least, they had been. Their bodies were gaunt, their limbs twisted at unnatural angles, and their hollow eyes stared straight ahead, unseeing. The keeper's words echoed in my mind, to feed it. Before I could process what I was seeing, the altar began to tremble. The substance on its surface seemed to come alive, writhing and bubbling as though it had a will of its own. The whispers grew louder, their voices urging me forward. "Feed," they chanted. "Feed the house." I stumbled back, the key slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. The chamber trembled violently, and a low, guttural growl reverberated through the air. The house was hungry, and it was done waiting. I turned and ran, the whispers chasing me as I scrambled up the staircase. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows clawing at my limbs, but I didn't stop. When I reached the top, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening thud. The house fell silent once more, but the silence was different now. It was heavy, oppressive, filled with a palpable sense of anticipation. I knew what the house wanted. It had spared me so far, but it wouldn't be merciful for long. The photograph flashed in my mind, the family, the shadowy figure, the word 13. I wasn't just another occupant of the house. I was its 13th life. The house had spoken. It didn't need words. The silence was enough, weighted with expectation and the inescapable dread of what was to come. I couldn't breathe without feeling the house inhale alongside me, its rhythm inescapable. It wasn't just alive, it was waiting, watching, planning. The word 13 pounded in my mind like a drumbeat, its implications clear now. I was the 13th owner, caught in a web of terror that had ensnared every soul before me. But the question that gnawed at the edge of my sanity was this: why? What did the house want? I didn't want to know, but I knew I had no choice. I spent the day pacing the house, the key heavy in my pocket, its cold metal a constant reminder of the door it was meant to unlock. The whispers had started again, faint at first but growing louder with each passing hour. They didn't chant this time, they wept. The voices blended into a mournful cacophony, as though the walls were mourning something or someone. The air grew colder as the sun dipped below the horizon, the shadows lengthening until they seemed to stretch across the room like claws. The house was awake now, fully aware of my presence, and its hunger was palpable. When the knocking began, I didn't flinch this time. I knew it would come. I knew it wouldn't stop until I answered. The house wanted me to feed it. The key led me to another hidden door, this one tucked away in the upstairs hallway, almost invisible in the dim light. The door was smaller than the others, its surface covered in the same strange symbols I'd seen in the basement and on the altar. The whispers urged me forward, their voices blending into a single mournful plea. Feed us. My hand trembled as I inserted the key into the lock. It turned smoothly, almost eagerly, and the door swung open with a low groan. Beyond the door was a narrow passageway, its walls lined with candles that flickered and danced in the stale air. The passage seemed to stretch on forever, the faint glow of the candles fading into darkness. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to turn back. But the house wouldn't let me. The passage led to a room unlike any I'd seen before. It was circular, its walls adorned with carvings that seemed to shift and writhe in the candlelight. In the center of the room was a pit, its depths shrouded in darkness. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the whispers were deafening now, their voices echoing from the pit in a dissonant symphony. I approached the edge, my heart pounding, and peered into the abyss. The darkness seemed alive, shifting and undulating like a living thing. And then I saw them. Faces, hundreds of them. Their features twisted in agony, their hollow eyes staring up at me. They reached out with skeletal hands, their fingers grasping at the air as though trying to pull themselves free. The others, I realized with a jolt, the ones who came before me. The whispers grew louder, their voices blending into a single, guttural command. Feed the house. I stumbled back, my mind racing. The house didn't want food or offerings. It wanted lives. The keeper's words echoed in my mind. To feed it, to keep it alive. I had become part of the cycle, the 13th in a line of victims sacrificed to sustain the house's unholy existence. But I wasn't ready to give in, not yet. The whispers roared, and the room began to tremble. The pit seemed to grow larger, its edges creeping toward me as the faces below clawed their way upward. I turned and ran, the whispers chasing me as I fled the room and slammed the door shut behind me. The house was alive, and it was hungry, but I wasn't going to be its next meal. The house was alive, and it wanted me. Every creak of the floorboards, every whispered plea in the walls, every shifting shadow was a reminder that I was trapped in its jaws. But I had something the 12 who came before me didn't, a choice. The faces in the pit haunted me. They weren't just nameless, forgotten souls. They were victims like me. Each of them must have stood where I now stood, gripped by terror and desperation, all consumed by the same question. How do I escape? The answer came to me not in a flash of clarity, but in the subtle murmurs of my own defiance. The house thrived on fear, on submission. To break the cycle, I couldn't feed it. I had to starve it. That night, the house didn't hold back. The knocking started shortly after sunset, frantic and relentless. The walls shook with the force of it, their breathing heavy and erratic, as though the house itself was panicking. The whispers weren't mournful this time, they were enraged. The lights flickered and died, plunging the house into darkness. Shadows coalesced in the corners of the room, their forms twisting and writhing like creatures clawing their way into existence. A low, guttural growl reverberated through the air, and I felt the house's hunger like a physical force pressing down on me. I clutched the two keys tightly, their cold metal grounding me as the chaos around me reached a fever pitch. The house wanted me to open the final door, the one that would complete its ritual. But I refused to give it what it wanted. Instead, I ran. The house didn't make it easy. The hallways stretched endlessly, the doors shifting and rearranging themselves to trap me in an ever-changing maze. The whispers grew louder, their voices blending into a single, thunderous roar that seemed to emanate from the very foundation of the house. But I didn't stop. I ran until my legs burned and my lungs ached, until I finally stumbled upon the one thing I'd been searching for. The front door. It stood before me, massive and imposing, its surface covered in the same symbols that adorned the hidden doors and the walls of the chamber. The keys in my hand pulsed with a faint, unnatural light, and I knew what I had to do. The house didn't need lives. It needed belief, and I was about to strip it of its power. I hurled the keys at the door with all my strength, the metal striking the wood with a resounding clang. The air seemed to crackle with energy as the symbols on the door began to glow, their light growing brighter and brighter until it filled the room. The house screamed. The sound was deafening, a primal roar of rage and pain that shook the very walls. The floor beneath me buckled, and I fell to my knees, clutching my ears as the house writhed and twisted around me. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. I opened my eyes to find the front door ajar, its once menacing symbols faded and lifeless. The house was silent now, its oppressive presence gone. The walls no longer breathed, and the whispers had vanished. For the first time since I'd stepped foot inside, the house felt empty. I didn't look back as I stepped outside, the cool night air washing over me like a balm. The stars glittered overhead, and the distant hum of crickets filled the silence the house had left behind. It was over. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house wasn't truly gone. Its hunger had been quelled, its power broken, but something told me it was only a matter of time before it found someone else to lure in, someone else to feed it. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to the Real Haunted Archive Stories channel, comment, and turn the notification on for more chilling tales. You never know what might be lurking in the darkness.